While most of us fall asleep believing history is loud, filled with wars, speeches, and famous names, the real story of America was often whispered in candlelit rooms, behind locked doors, by men who never wanted to be remembered. Tonight you'll drift into the hidden world of secret brotherhoods, groups that shaped the United States without ever stepping into the spotlight. Before we begin, gently subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these quiet stories that history tried to forget. Now, let's begin. In the early centuries of America, power was not something people trusted, it was not admired, and it was certainly not celebrated. Power was something to be careful around, something that arrived quietly, stayed too long, and rarely left without taking something with it for the people. Living in the American colonies under the rule of the British Crown, power was not an abstract idea. It had a face, it had a uniform, it knocked on doors, it collected taxes, it enforced laws written thousands of miles away by people who would never step foot on colonial soil. Public power, open, visible authority, was associated with control, punishment, and obedience. Governors were appointed, not chosen. Judges answered to the crown. Soldiers were housed among civilians. Laws could change without warning, and any gathering, speech, or printed idea that questioned authority could be labeled dangerous. This environment created a deep psychological wound. Colonists learned early that visibility was risky. Speaking loudly invited attention. Attention invited consequences, and consequences were rarely fair. So instead of learning how to rule openly, early Americans learned how to influence quietly. They learned that survival often depended on staying unnoticed, that ideas spread better when whispered, that trust was safest when shared only among those who had proven loyalty, and that power, when hidden, could not be easily crushed. This mindset did not appear overnight. It developed slowly, generation by generation, shaped by fear, memory, and experience. Colonial life taught a simple lesson. The more visible power became, the more dangerous it was. Public institutions represented authority imposed from above, but private gatherings, homes, taverns, workshops, churches, represented safety. These were places where men could speak freely, question ideas, and imagine alternatives without fear of immediate punishment. Over time, these private spaces became something more. They became networks. In a world where official channels served the crown, unofficial channels served the people. Letters were written in coded language. Meetings were arranged under innocent pretexts. Symbols replaced signatures. Trust replaced titles. Secrecy was not about mystery, it was about protection. Colonists watched what happened when authority felt threatened. Printers were jailed. Merchants were fined. Protesters were labeled traitors. Public opposition brought swift response. Quiet resistance, however, was harder to track. This is why influence mattered more than visibility. The goal was not to be seen leading. The goal was to shape thinking, to guide decisions from behind the scenes, to create unity without announcing it, to build momentum without drawing attention. In this environment, power was redefined. Power was no longer the man standing at a podium. Power was the man others listened to in private. Power was the person who connected groups without appearing to command them. The colonial experience also taught another painful lesson. Authority could not be trusted simply because it was official. The laws enforced in the colonies were often disconnected from local realities. Taxes were imposed without representation. Trade was restricted for the benefit of distant interests. Punishments were harsh and uneven. As a result, legitimacy shifted away from institutions and toward relationships. People trusted people, not systems, and trust, once broken publicly, could only be rebuilt privately. This laid the emotional foundation for secrecy becoming a cultural instinct, not a tactic, not a conspiracy, but a way of existing under pressure. Men who would later shape America grew up absorbing this lesson long before independence was ever imagined. If you want to survive under unchecked authority, never let your influence become too visible. This belief would not fade with time, it would deepen, and as tensions rose, secrecy would move from being a survival mechanism to becoming a strategy. As the colonies matured, so did their understanding of power and their suspicion of it. By the early 1700s, colonial society had developed a quiet contradiction. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. Laws were obeyed, churches were attended, trade continued. But beneath this calm exterior, distrust of centralized authority was growing like a slow-burning fire. The problem was not order itself. The problem was who controlled it. Colonists did not reject structure. They rejected distant control. They believed that authority, when separated from the people it governed, became careless at best and cruel at worst. Public power was associated with distance. Decisions were made overseas. Appeals took months. Justice felt impersonal, and accountability was nearly non-existent. This made visible authority feel dangerous, even when it appeared stable. Secrecy, on the other hand, offered something public power could not: mutual accountability. In small, private groups, everyone knew everyone. Reputation mattered. Loyalty was tested over time. Betrayal carried immediate consequences, not from law, but from exclusion. These private circles became places where trust replaced enforcement, and slowly they became places where ideas evolved. Ideas about self-rule, ideas about rights, ideas about resistance. But these ideas could not survive in open daylight. The mere suggestion that authority could be questioned was riz. Open discussion of reform could be interpreted as rebellion, and rebellion, under imperial law, was treason. So conversations happened quietly. They happened at night. They happened behind closed doors. They happened among men who shared not only beliefs but risk. Secrecy allowed ideas to mature before they were exposed. It gave people time to refine arguments, build alliances, and measure loyalty. In many ways, secrecy functioned like an incubation chamber. Ideas that were fragile in public became strong in private. Another reason secrecy felt safer was the memory of failure. Colonists were not naive. They knew uprisings had failed before, in other parts of the empire. Open revolts were easy to identify and crush. Leaders were arrested. Movements collapsed. Visibility made movements predictable. Secrecy made them adaptable. When no single leader was visible, no single arrest could end the cause. When plans were shared only in fragments, betrayal caused less damage. When authority did not know where influence lived, it could not easily destroy it. This is why early American resistance favored networks over hierarchies. Instead of clear chains of command, influence moved sideways. Information flowed quietly. Decisions emerged through consensus rather than decree. This structure mirrored the colonists' emotional reality. They had lived under rigid hierarchy, and they distrusted it, so they built something different. They built systems where power was earned, not assigned, where authority came from trust, not title, where leadership was subtle, not announced. Even after independence became imaginable, this fear did not disappear. If anything, it intensified. Because the greatest fear was not foreign power. It was the possibility of recreating it. Many early Americans worried that public authority once established could become just as distant and oppressive as the system they were trying to escape. Kings could be replaced. Tyranny could wear new names. So secrecy remained attractive. Hidden influence felt safer than visible control. Quiet guidance felt less dangerous than loud leadership. This is why early America did not simply overthrow one system and embrace another. It hesitated, it questioned, it debated, often in private. The fear of power in plain sight shaped not only how resistance formed, but how governance itself would later be designed. Checks, balances, limits, safeguards, all born from a single haunting lesson learned under colonial rule. Power, when too visible and unchecked, always forgets who it serves. And so, before America ever became a nation, it became something else first. A culture that trusted whispers more than proclamations, loyalty more than law, and hidden influence more than open authority. That fear would leave a permanent mark on its history, long before secret societies ever took root in American soil. They were already woven into the fabric of Europe itself. They did not begin as conspiracies. They were not born from darkness or rebellion. Instead, they emerged naturally, out of necessity, survival, and human trust. In medieval Europe, secrecy was not unusual, it was practical. Cities were crowded, power was centralized, knowledge was controlled. And for ordinary people, especially craftsmen and thinkers, survival often depended on discretion. This was the world that gave birth to guilds. Guilds were not secret in name, but they were private in practice. They governed skills: stone-cutting, metalwork, carpentry, printing, professions that required years of training and precise knowledge. To protect their craft, guilds restricted access. Techniques were passed down quietly, from master to apprentice, through ritual, symbol, and oath. A man did not simply learn a trade, he was initiated into it. These initiations were serious affairs. Apprentices swore loyalty. They promised not to reveal methods to outsiders. Symbols were used to identify membership. Certain signs or gestures allowed members to recognize one another across cities without speaking openly. Secrecy preserved value. If everyone knew how to build a cathedral, carve a keystone, or forge precise instruments, the craft would lose its power. Knowledge was currency, and currency needed protection. This mindset, knowledge guarded through brotherhood, would become one of Europe's greatest cultural exports. Alongside guilds existed another form of quiet association: religious brotherhoods. Europe was deeply religious, but religion itself was fragmented by power struggles. Kings ruled churches, churches ruled kings, and dissent, real or perceived, was dangerous. In response, private religious circles formed. Some were mystical, Some were philosophical. Some focused on charity or study. What they shared was a preference for inner belief over public display. Faith, for these groups, was something discussed quietly, interpreted carefully, practiced among the trusted. Once again, secrecy was not rebellion, it was protection. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, secrecy took on a new purpose. Ideas began to change faster than institutions. Scientific discoveries challenged religious authority. Philosophers questioned monarchy. Thinkers debated natural rights, reason, and the limits of power. But open discussion was risky. Censorship was common, printing presses were monitored, books were banned, writers could be imprisoned, or worse. So ideas traveled underground. Private salons, reading circles, intellectual societies. These were places where men gathered to discuss forbidden questions. Who should rule? What gives authority legitimacy? Does truth require permission? These groups often adopted rituals, not because they believed in mysticism, but because ritual created unity. It slowed conversation, it added weight, it separated the inner world from the dangerous outer one. Among the most influential of these traditions was Freemasons, emerging from stonemason guilds. Freemasonry preserved the language of construction, levels, squares, foundations, as metaphors for moral and intellectual growth. Its meetings were private, its symbols subtle, its teachings focused on ethics, discipline, and self-improvement rather than politics. But the structure itself was powerful. Men met as equals, titles were left at the door. Loyalty was horizontal, not vertical. Ideas could be shared without immediate judgment from crown or church. This was revolutionary, not in action but in design. By the 1600s and 1700s, Europe was filled with such circles. Some were spiritual, some intellectual, some professional. But all shared the same logic. Public life belongs to authority, private life belongs to trust. This was the culture that European settlers carried with them across the Atlantic. They did not bring only tools, language, and religion. They brought habits, they brought instincts, they brought quiet ways of organizing power. And when they arrived in the American colonies, those instincts found fertile ground. The Atlantic Ocean did not erase European habits, it amplified them. When settlers arrived in the American colonies, they entered a world that was physically vast but politically narrow. Authority still belonged to Europe. Governors answered to kings, laws reflected imperial interests. And once again, open dissent carried risk. But something was different this time. The distance from Europe created space, not just geographical space, but psychological space. In America, secrecy was no longer only about survival. It became about possibility. European secret traditions adapted quickly to colonial life. Guild-like structures formed among merchants and craftsmen. Intellectual circles appeared in cities and towns. Men gathered in taverns, homes, and workshops, not just to socialize but to think. They brought with them European rituals, but simplified them. They retained symbols, but focused more on shared values than hierarchy. Why? Because America was not bound by centuries of class structure. In Europe, secret societies often mirrored the rigid social order. In America, they softened it. A man's ideas could matter more than his title. His loyalty could matter more than his lineage. This made brotherhoods especially attractive. Secrecy offered equality. In private meetings, A farmer could speak alongside a merchant, a printer alongside a lawyer. These were conversations that would never happen in public halls, and those conversations mattered. The Enlightenment ideals discussed quietly in Europe, reason, liberty, natural rights, found new energy in the colonies. Here they were not just philosophical, they were practical. How should a society govern itself? Who deserves representation? What limits should exist on authority? Once again, secrecy provided safety. These ideas were not illegal, but they were suspicious. Open discussion could attract attention from colonial officials. Quiet discussion allowed the M to mature. European secret traditions also brought something else to America: structure. Colonists did not invent secret societies from scratch. They inherited frameworks that had already survived centuries of pressure. They knew how to organize meetings, how to establish trust, how to recognize members, how to pass information discreetly. This knowledge was invaluable. When tensions with imperial authority increased, colonists already possessed the tools needed to organize without exposure. The transition from European private circles to American secret brotherhoods was not dramatic. It was organic. Old habits met new conditions. The American environment, spread out, loosely governed, culturally mixed, made secrecy easier and more effective. Information traveled slowly. Surveillance was limited. Communities were interconnected. European traditions thrived here, but they also changed. American secret societies became less focused on preserving old knowledge and more focused on shaping the future. The emphasis shifted from protecting crafts or beliefs to protecting ideas. Ideas about independence, ideas about self-rule, ideas about legitimacy. Secrecy was no longer just a shield, it became a tool. By the time revolutionary sentiment began to surface, the infrastructure was already there. Trust networks existed. Communication channels were established. Men were accustomed to meeting privately and speaking carefully. The American Revolution did not emerge from Chau's. It emerged from quiet preparation. And that preparation was deeply European in origin. Even after independence, these traditions did not disappear. The new nation inherited not only European political theory, but European caution, the fear of centralized power, the preference for private influence, the belief that authority must be restrained, not only by law, but by culture. Secret societies in America would continue to evolve, but their roots remained visible beneath the surface. They were descendants of guilds that protected knowledge, of brotherhoods that guarded belief, of Enlightenment circles that questioned power quietly before challenging it publicly. The Atlantic Ocean changed many things, but it did not change human nature. People still trusted whispers more than proclamations, still believed private loyalty was safer than public allegiance, still understood that the most powerful ideas often grow best in silence. And so, long before America became a nation, it became a continuation, a distant echo, of Europe's quiet traditions, reshaped by a new land, but guided by old instincts. Long before America had a flag, a constitution, or even a shared identity, there existed a quiet language spoken among certain men, a language made not of speeches, but of symbols, not of declarations, but of silence. That language belonged to freemasons. To understand why Freemasonry mattered to the founding generation, it is important to understand what it was not. It was not a political party. It was not a religion, and it was not a secret government. Instead, Freemasonry was a method, a way of organizing trust in a world where trust was rare. Its roots stretched back to Europe, where stonemasons once traveled from city to city, building cathedrals and castles. Their skills were valuable, their knowledge was guarded, and their safety depended on recognizing one another without speaking openly. From this practical need grew a symbolic tradition. Tools of labor became metaphors. The square represented morality, the compass represented restraint, the unfinished stone represented the human soul, always improving, never complete. When Freemasonry evolved beyond literal stonemasons, it carried these ideas forward. Men were no longer shaping buildings. They were shaping themselves. This mattered deeply in the 1700s. Public life was rigid. Titles defined worth. Authority flowed downward. Questioning power openly was dangerous. Freemasonry offered an alternative space. Inside the lodge, men met as equals. Rank was left outside the door. A merchant stood beside a farmer, a lawyer beside a printer. What mattered was character, discipline, and loyalty, not social status. This was rare, and it was powerful. But the true strength of Freemasonry was not what was said inside lodges. It was what was not said outside them. Silence was a discipline. Members were trained to listen more than they spoke, to observe before acting, to protect conversations held in confidence. This was not secrecy for drama, it was secrecy for stability. In a time when words could be weaponized, silence was safety. Symbols served the same purpose. A handshake, a gesture, a phrase with layered meaning. These allowed recognition without exposure. A man could know he was among brothers without announcing it. Trust could be established quietly. This was invaluable in colonial America. The colonies were full of tension. Ideas about liberty, self-rule, and rights were spreading, but cautiously. Public discussion attracted attention from authorities loyal to the crown. Freemasonry provided a neutral ground. Within lodges, men could discuss philosophy, ethics, and governance without declaring rebellion. The language was abstract, symbolic, moral rather than political. Yet ideas have a way of traveling. When men left the lodge, they carried with them habits of thought, respect for law, but skepticism of unchecked authority, loyalty to principle over personality, belief in improvement through reason rather than force. These ideas did not shout, they whispered, and whispers travel far when they are trusted. Freemasonry also trained men to think long-term. Its rituals were slow, deliberate, repetitive. They encouraged patience, reflection, self-control. This was not accidental. The founding generation lived in an era of uncertainty. Decisions carried consequences that could echo for generations. Emotional leadership was dangerous. Impulsive action could destroy fragile alliances. Freemasonry taught restraint. It taught men to weigh actions carefully, to value consensus over dominance, to understand that leadership was not about visibility, but about steadiness. This mindset shaped how many founders approached change. They did not rush. They debated quietly. They tested ideas privately before presenting them publicly. Freemasonry did not tell them what to think, but it shaped how they thought. And in a world preparing to redefine power, that made all the difference. As the American colonies edged closer to independence, pressure mounted from all sides. Loyalty to the crown was expected. Resistance was punished. Neutrality became difficult. In this environment, trust was currency. Men needed to know who they could rely on, not just in words but in character. Freemasonry offered something rare, tested loyalty. Membership was not casual. Initiation required commitment. Advancement required discipline. A man's reputation followed him from lodge to lodge. Betrayal was remembered. This created a network of men bound not by ideology, but by values, honor, discretion, mutual responsibility. When tensions escalated, these bonds mattered. Communication between colonies was slow and unreliable. Letters could be intercepted. Public meetings were monitored. Open organization risked exposure, but private networks endured. Men who shared Masonic ties did not automatically agree on every issue, but they shared a foundation of trust. They believed disagreements could be resolved without public fracture. This helped prevent chaos. The founding generation was not unified by passion alone. It was unified by process, by a shared belief that order mattered as much as freedom. Freemasonry reinforced this belief. It emphasized structure, rules, boundaries. Even its secrecy had limits. Members were taught that loyalty to moral law outweighed loyalty to any brother. That secrecy was meant to protect ideas, not excuse wrongdoing. That authority must be restrained by conscience. These teachings aligned naturally with emerging American principles. Fear of tyranny was widespread, but fear of disorder was just as strong. The founders understood that replacing one ruler with another solved nothing. Power needed limits. Ambition needed restraint. Emotion needed balance. Freemasonry offered a model, not of government, but of governance. Its lodges operated through written rules. Officers were elected. Terms were limited. Decisions followed procedure. Disputes were mediated rather than forced. These habits shaped expectations. When the time came to design institutions, the founders were already familiar with systems that balanced authority and accountability. This is why Freemasonry's influence is subtle. It did not dictate policy. It did not issue commands. It did not act publicly. Its impact lived in tone rather than text, in the patience of debate, in the preference for compromise, in the suspic ion of absolute power. Even after independence, Freemasonry remained deliberately quiet. There were no proclamations claiming credit, no declarations of influence, no attempts to dominate public life. This restraint was intentional. Visibility threatened trust. Freemasonry understood that once influence becomes obvious, it becomes vulnerable to misinterpretation, manipulation, and fear. So it remained what it had always been, a background presence, a place where men reflected rather than reacted, where loyalty was earned, not demanded, where silence was strength. Over time, myths would grow. People would imagine hidden hands controlling history, secret masters pulling strings, invisible rulers shaping destiny. But the truth is calmer and more human. Freemasonry did not control the founding generation. It prepared some of them. It gave them habits of thought suited for uncertain times. It taught them to value restraint over dominance. It reminded them that power, once gained, must be guarded against itself. In the end, Freemasonry's greatest influence was not political. It was psychological. It shaped men who feared power enough to limit it, who valued unity enough to compromise, who understood that freedom without discipline collapses into chaos. And so, quietly, without banners or applause, Freemasonry became part of the atmosphere in which America was formed. Not as a ruler, not as a secret government, but as a school of silence, symbols, and steady loyalty. Echoing softly behind the loud moments of history. In colonial America, silence was not empty. It was protective. Long before revolution became an open idea, the colonies lived under a constant, quiet pressure, the feeling of being watched, not always openly, not always aggressively, but persistently enough to shape behavior, language, and thought. Authority in the colonies flowed from the British Crown, and that authority depended on information. To govern from across the ocean, the Crown relied on reports, letters, loyal officials, and informants. Every colony had eyes and ears. Every town had someone willing or forced to listen. Surveillance did not always look like soldiers on the street. Sometimes it looked like a customs officer reading shipping logs. Sometimes it looked like a governor attending a dinner. Sometimes it looked like a neighbor asking too many questions. Words were not just expressions, they were evidence. A careless sentence spoken in public could travel farther than intended. A joke about taxes, a complaint about unfair laws, a question about rights. In the wrong ears, these could become accusations. And accusations, once written down, were difficult to escape. Colonists knew this. They watched what happened to printers, whose presses published the wrong ideas. They saw merchants fined or imprisoned for resisting trade laws. They heard of men arrested not for actions, but for opinions. Punishment did not require rebellion. Suspicion was enough. This environment trained people to be cautious. Public spaces became places of performance. People learned to speak in neutral terms. Loyalty was displayed openly, even when doubt lived privately. True thoughts moved underground. Secrecy became the difference between survival and ruin. Meetings were held quietly. Locations changed often. Invitations were personal, not posted. Conversations were framed carefully. Ideas were introduced slowly, tested gently, withdrawn if necessary. Nothing was rushed, because the cost of exposure was severe. The British legal system treated resistance harshly. Charges like sedition or treason were broad and flexible. Evidence could be circumstantial. Trials could be delayed. Punishments could include imprisonment, exile, or death. Even association was dangerous. To be known as someone who gathered with dissenters was enough to place a man under scrutiny. To be linked to organizers, even indirectly, could end a career, destroy a business, or tear apart a family. This is why revolutionary ideas did not spread through speeches or pamphlets at first. They spread through relationships, trusted friends, family members, long-standing associates. Ideas were passed the way fragile objects are handled, with care, patience, and respect for their danger. Secrecy also protected something deeper than safety. It protected time. Revolutionary ideas needed time to mature, to be debated, to be refined. Public exposure too early could kill them before they were strong enough to survive opposition. The Crown's surveillance made patience necessary. Authorities were skilled at responding to visible threats. Public protests could be suppressed. Leaders could be isolated. Organizations could be dismantled. But quiet thought was harder to stop. Secrecy allowed ideas to grow without interruption. It gave men space to ask dangerous questions privately before risking them publicly. It allowed disagreement without fracture. It permitted evolution. In this sense, secrecy was not about hiding action. It was about protecting thought. And in an empire built on control, protecting thought was the most radical act of all. As tensions deepened, the consequences of exposure became clearer and more frightening. The British Empire had learned hard lessons from past rebellions. Open resistance was met with force. Leaders were identified early. Movements were dismantled quickly. Fear was used as a warning to others. Colonists paid attention. They understood that the most dangerous stage of any movement was its beginning, when ideas were visible but support was fragile. This is where secrecy became essential. Revolutionary thinking did not start with weapons. It started with doubt. Doubt about fairness. Doubt about legitimacy. Doubt about obedience. These doubts had to be shared carefully. One wrong conversation could end everything. This is why secrecy took on ritual, structure, and discipline. It was not casual. It was practiced. Men learned not to write certain things down. Letters were vague. Language was coded. Meanings were layered. Outsiders could read the words without understanding the intent. Meetings avoided fixed schedules. Locations shifted. Attendance was limited. New participants were observed quietly before being trusted. This was not paranoia. It was experience. Colonists knew that informants existed. Some were loyalists. Some were coerced. Some were simply opportunists seeking favor. Surveillance thrived on visibility. Secrecy denied it that advantage. By keeping leadership diffuse and influence informal, revolutionary networks avoided collapse. There was no single head to cut off, no central office to raid, no official membership list to seize. Ideas belonged to everyone and no one. This made punishment difficult. If arrested, a man could truthfully claim he acted alone, or that he misunderstood, or that conversations were philosophical, not political. Ambiguity became protection. Even silence became a statement. Refusing to speak was safer than speaking incorrectly. Silence could not be quoted. It could not be twisted. It could not be used as evidence. This is why many early revolutionaries appeared cautious, even hesitant, in public records. They were not unsure. They were careful. They understood that surviving long enough to succeed mattered more than dramatic gestures. Execution was the ultimate threat. Treason was punishable by death. And the definition of treason was wide, supporting resistance, encouraging dissent, undermining authority. Secrecy was the barrier between disagreement and the gallows. It allowed men to imagine a different future without immediately paying the highest price for imagining it. As revolutionary sentiment grew stronger, secrecy did not disappear. It evolved. Private discussions became coordinated action. Quiet networks became organized resistance. But even then, visibility was managed. Public acts were supported by hidden planning. This duality, public courage supported by private caution, defined the revolutionary period, and it left a lasting imprint. Even after independence, the memory of surveillance remained. The fear of unchecked authority lingered. The instinct to protect ideas before exposing them became cultural. America was not born shouting, it was born whispering. Those whispers survived because secrecy made survival possible. Not secrecy for power, not secrecy for control, but secrecy for life. Because in a world where ideas could cost you everything, silence was not weakness, it was wisdom. Before they ever became a name written in history books, the Sons of Liberty were something far quieter. They were neighbors who nodded instead of speaking, merchants who said less than they knew, men who gathered without ever calling it a meeting. In the beginning, the Sons of Liberty were not an organization in the modern sense. There were no public charters, no official membership lists, no headquarters marked on a map. That absence was intentional because visibility was dangerous. The British authorities did not need proof of rebellion to act. Suspicion was enough. Rumors could justify arrests. Association alone could destroy livelihoods. So the Sons of Liberty learned early that survival depended on shadows. Their first rule was simple: never appear organized. Outwardly, they looked like ordinary colonists, shopkeepers, printers, dock workers, craftsmen. Inwardly, they were something else entirely, a network of shared resentment, quiet resistance, and growing resolve. Communication was the greatest challenge. Letters could be intercepted. Taverns were full of listeners. Public speeches were watched. Even private homes could not always be trusted. So the Sons of Liberty adopted coded language. They spoke in metaphors. Taxes became burdens. British policies became storms. Resistance became weathering. Outsiders could hear these words without understanding their meaning. Language created cover. A conversation about shipping might really be about protest. A complaint about trade could signal readiness for action. Casual remarks carried layered meaning, clear to those inside the circle, harmless to everyone else. This coding extended beyond words. Dates were disguised. Locations were vague. Plans were divided into pieces so no one man knew everything. Meetings rarely happened in obvious places. Instead of halls or public rooms, gatherings took place where they could blend in. Taverns were common, not because they were noisy, but because noise provided camouflage. A group of men talking over drinks attracted little attention. Sometimes meetings happened in workshops, sometimes in private homes, sometimes outdoors where conversations could be mistaken for casual labor. Attendance was never announced. An invitation might come as a suggestion, a glance, a phrase spoken in passing. Trust was tested slowly. New faces were observed before being included. This caution shaped the culture of the Sons of Liberty. They did not rush decisions. They did not announce intentions. They valued patience over speed. Even leadership was subtle. Certain men were influential, but they rarely acted as visible commanders. Influence flowed through persuasion, not orders. Consensus mattered more than hierarchy. This made the group resilient. If one man was questioned, others could continue. If a meeting was disrupted, another would form elsewhere. The movement did not rely on a single voice or location. It relied on shared understanding. Symbols played a crucial role. Visual signals replaced written ones. A lantern in a window, a mark on a door, an object placed deliberately. These signals conveyed information quickly and quietly. To outsiders they meant nothing. To insiders they spoke volumes. This system allowed coordination without exposure. British officials often sensed unrest, but could not trace it. They knew something was happening, but not where it began or who led it. This uncertainty frustrated authority, and that frustration was power, because a movement that cannot be clearly seen cannot be easily crushed. As tensions escalated, the Sons of Liberty refined their methods. They understood that action required unity, but unity did not require visibility. Public protests, when they occurred, were carefully prepared in private. By the time crowds gathered, the groundwork was already laid. Messages had been passed. Roles had been assigned quietly. Escape routes were considered. Even then, accountability was diffuse. No single man claimed responsibility. No official statement confirmed coordination. This ambiguity protected individuals and preserved the network. British authorities struggled with this structure. They were accustomed to clear hierarchies, leaders, orders, chains of command. The Sons of Liberty offered none of these openly. Instead, they operated like a current beneath the surface, shaping direction without revealing source. Hidden signals became more sophisticated. A church bell rung at an unusual hour. A gathering framed as a celebration. A sudden change in routine. Each signal was ordinary enough to be ignored, but meaningful enough to mobilize those who understood. This approach reduced risk. If questioned, a man could truthfully deny wrongdoing. A bell ringing was not a crime. A group assembling was not illegal. Meaning existed only in shared understanding. His separation between appearance and intent was critical. It allowed resistance to exist without immediate punishment. The Sons of Liberty also understood the psychological value of secrecy. It created belonging. To be trusted with coded language and hidden knowledge made members feel responsible. Loyalty deepened. Carelessness decreased. Secrecy demanded discipline. Men learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned that restraint was not weakness, but strength. This discipline prevented fragmentation. Disagreements happened privately. Conflicts were resolved quietly. Unity was preserved publicly. Even as revolutionary sentiment grew stronger, the Sons of Liberty avoided unnecessary exposure. They did not seek credit. They did not seek recognition. They sought results. And when independence finally moved from idea to action, the Sons of Liberty faded from prominence. Not because they failed, but because their purpose changed. Their methods had worked. The habits they developed, coded communication, decentralized organization, quiet coordination, became part of the revolutionary culture itself. Even after independence, their influence lingered. Americans inherited a distrust of loud power, a respect for private planning, a belief that true influence often moves unseen. The Sons of Liberty did not write constitutions. They did not govern openly. They did not rule. But they created space. Space for ideas to grow safely. Space for resistance to survive long enough to succeed. Space for a nation to be imagined before it could exist. They remind us of something easily forgotten. Not all revolutions begin with speeches. Some begin with silence. And sometimes the most powerful movements are the ones that learn how to disappear when watched, and reappear only when ready. In societies where words are watched, meaning learns how to hide. In early America, symbols became a second language, one that spoke quietly, patiently, and without sound. Long before newspapers could speak freely or public speeches could challenge authority, symbols carried ideas safely through hostile environments. They were carved into stone, pressed into metal, printed onto paper, and most people never noticed. This was not accidental. Symbolic communication had deep roots in Europe, especially among guilds, brotherhoods, and philosophical circles. These groups understood a simple truth. Words could be quoted, twisted, or punished, but symbols were ambiguous. They could be denied. They could be misunderstood. They could pass unnoticed. A symbol did not argue. It suggested. And suggestion was safer than declaration. In colonial America, this symbolic habit became invaluable. Public buildings were often constructed by craftsmen trained in European traditions. These builders did not merely assemble walls and roofs, they embedded meaning into their work. A carefully placed carving, a specific IC arrangement of shapes, a deliberate orientation toward light or space. To most observers, these were decorative choices. To those who understood the language, they were messages. This practice was especially familiar to members of freemasons, who inherited a long tradition of symbolic teaching. In Freemasonry, symbols were not secrets to be hidden forever. They were lessons meant to be discovered gradually. A square did not simply mean a tool. It meant moral balance. A compass did not merely measure distance. It represented restraint and boundaries. These symbols could exist openly because their meanings were layered. Outsiders saw objects. Insiders saw instruction. This layering made symbols ideal for a watched society. As colonial towns grew, buildings became texts. Courthouses, meeting halls, and churches sometimes carried imagery that reflected ideas about order, justice, and human improvement. None of this challenged authority directly, but it shaped how people thought about authority. Symbols guided perception quietly. Currency played a similar role. Money passed through every hand. It was trusted, examined, and carried daily. This made it an ideal vehicle for imagery, especially imagery that could not be easily censored. Early American designs often included motifs inherited from European symbolic traditions: eyes, pyramids, rays of light, balanced scales. Each image could be explained innocently, yet each carried deeper meaning for those familiar with its symbolic history. An eye could represent divine oversight or awareness. Light could mean guidance or enlightenment. Balance could suggest justice or restraint of power. Nothing was stated plainly. Everything was implied. Documents too spoke symbolically. Official papers used formal language, but layout mattered. Placement mattered. Even the choice of phrasing could signal allegiance or philosophy without explicit declaration. Certain words were favored not for their clarity but for their flexibility. They allowed agreement among people who interpreted them differently. They created unity without forcing uniformity. Symbols did the same thing visually. They allowed people to share values without stating them aloud. This was essential in a world where open agreement could be dangerous. Symbolic communication also allowed continuity. As generations changed, symbols remained. They did not age like words. They did not become outdated. A symbol carved into stone could speak decades later without being rewritten. In this way, ideas outlived individuals. And this endurance mattered, because secrecy was not only about protection, it was about preservation. As America moved closer to independence, symbols did not disappear. They multiplied. Revolutionary ideas needed cohesion, but cohesion did not require slogans. It required shared understanding. Symbols provided that understanding quietly. They appeared on flags, on seals, on official emblems. One of the most enduring examples is the Great Seal of the United States, designed not as a manifesto, but as a layered image. Its elements could be explained publicly as representations of strength, unity, and providence. But its deeper structure reflected enlightenment and symbolic traditions familiar to European brotherhoods. The use of Latin phrases instead of plain English was deliberate. Latin was neutral. It avoided political interpretation. It connected the new nation to classical ideals without naming modern enemies. This choice mattered. Symbols allowed the founders to express ambition without provocation. They could suggest permanence without claiming dominance, unity without demanding obedience, purpose without prescribing belief. This restraint was intentional. America was built by people who feared visible power. Symbols allowed power to be expressed gently, without triggering the alarms that loud authority always sets off. Even architectural choices reflected this instinct. Public buildings borrowed from classical styles, not to imitate empires, but to associate the new nation with balance, proportion, and reason. Columns, symmetry, and open spaces communicated order without force. The message was subtle. Authority should be stable, not oppressive. Symbols also helped bridge differences. The colonies were diverse, religions varied, interests conflicted, language could divide, but symbols could unite. A shared image allowed multiple interpretations, each compatible with the who. This flexibility prevented fragmentation. People could project their values onto the same symbol without contradiction. That made symbols powerful tools for consensus. Over time, symbolic literacy faded. As freedom of speech expanded, words replaced images. Secrecy became less necessary. Symbols remained, but their meanings became historical rather than practical. Yet their presence still matters. They remind us that America was not shaped only by arguments and battles, but by careful communication, by patience, by people who understood that ideas survive best when they are protected from exposure too early. Symbols hidden in plain sight were never meant to control. They were meant to endure. They allowed ideas to pass safely through dangerous times. They preserved philosophies when words could not. They carried continuity across uncertainty. And even now, long after secrecy is no longer required, those symbols remain, quiet, patient, and still speaking to anyone willing to look beyond the surface, because the most lasting messages are often the ones that never raise their voice. In uncertain times, human beings look for something steady. When the world feels watched, when words feel dangerous, when trust feels fragile, ritual becomes an anchor. In early America, and long before it in Europe, rituals were not theatrical performances. They were tools, carefully designed moments that slowed the mind, calmed fear, and created meaning where chaos threatened to take over. Rituals worked because they removed urgency. They asked participants to pause, to breathe, to listen. In a colonial world filled with risk, speed was dangerous. Speaking quickly led to mistakes. Acting impulsively invited exposure. Rituals did the opposite. They forced patience. This is why secret brotherhoods relied on them so deeply. Groups such as the Freemasons understood something simple and powerful. Trust cannot be rushed. Trust must be felt, not argued. An oath spoken in silence carried more weight than promises shouted in public. The quiet itself became part of the meaning. When a man stood in stillness, surrounded by others doing the same, fear softened. Attention sharpened. Silence aligned people. It removed distractions. It equalized participants. It created shared presence. In that silence, words mattered more. An oath was not just a sentence, it was a moment, a line crossed intentionally, a decision witnessed by others who had already crossed it themselves. This shared experience created psychological depth. To break an oath was not merely to lie. It was to betray a moment that had reshaped identity. That is why oaths were so powerful. They transformed agreement into belonging. Rituals also removed individuality temporarily. Participants were guided through the same steps. They heard the same words. They stood in the same posture. Personal differences faded. A collective rhythm emerged. This created unity without force. No one was ordered to believe. No one was compelled to obey. They chose to participate. Choice made commitment stronger. Rituals also provided structure in a world where authority felt unstable. The British Crown represented rigid, imposed power. Brotherhood rituals offered something different, power that emerged from consent. This distinction mattered deeply. Colonists distrusted authority that demanded obedience, but they respected commitments freely made among equals. Rituals framed commitment as voluntary discipline rather than submission. That is why these practices felt calming rather than threatening. They replaced fear with familiarity. Each repetition reinforced safety. Each symbol reminded participants that they were not alone, that others shared the same risks and the same resolve. This emotional safety made honesty possible. Men could speak carefully, thoughtfully, without posturing. They did not need to prove loyalty constantly. Ritual had already done that work. Once trust was established, silence became natural. Not forced, not tense, but comfortable. Silence meant understanding. In a world where words could betray, silence protected, and protection allowed ideas to grow. As revolutionary pressure increased, brotherhood became more than comfort. It became survival. The threat was real. Surveillance was constant. Punishment was severe. In such conditions, fear could fracture movements quickly. But rituals and oaths prevented that fracture. They created something stronger than fear: identity. A man who took an oath was no longer acting only as an individual. He acted as part of something larger, something that had meaning beyond his own safety. This shift mattered. Fear speaks to the individual. Brotherhood speaks to the collective. When individuals are afraid, they withdraw. When a collective feels bound, it holds. Rituals reinforced this bond repeatedly. They reminded participants of shared values, shared risk, shared purpose. They created emotional memory, moments that could be recalled in times of doubt. Memory strengthens resolve. Even when separated, members carried those moments with them. They did not need constant communication. The bond already existed. This reduced vulnerability. If questioned, a man could remain calm. Panic was less likely. His loyalty was not dependent on immediate reassurance, it was rooted in experience. This is why shared silence was as important as shared speech. Silence trained restraint. It taught when not to act, when not to speak, when to wait. This discipline protected the group. Loose words destroy trust. Careless actions expose antworks. Ritual taught awareness. It slowed decision-making. It encouraged reflection. It replaced impulse with intention. Brotherhood also removed the need for constant surveillance within the group. Trust reduced suspicion. Members did not need to test one another repeatedly. They had already proven commitment through shared ritual. This allowed energy to be focused outward, on ideas, planning, and endurance. The power of these bonds explains why betrayal was rare, not because people were perfect, but because the cost was too high emotionally. Breaking an oath meant breaking connection, losing identity, becoming isolated in a world where isolation was dangerous. Brotherhood made loyalty personal, not ideological, not abstract, but human. Even after independence, these habits remained. Early American institutions reflected this mindset. They valued procedure, ceremony, oaths of office, quiet transitions of power. These were not empty traditions. They were psychological safeguards, designed by people who understood how fragile trust can be. Rituals slowed power down. They reminded leaders that authority was borrowed, not owned, that decisions carried weight, that silence before action mattered. The brotherhoods that shaped early America did not rely on force. They relied on calm in the face of uncertainty, calm in the presence of danger, calm born from shared commitment. This calm made endurance possible, and endurance made change inevitable. Because revolutions fueled only by anger burn out, revolutions sustained by trust endure. In the end, oaths and rituals were not about secrecy for its own sake. They were about care for people, care for ideas, care for the future. And that care, quiet, patient, and disciplined, became one of the strongest forces shaping the birth of a nation. Not all power seeks a spotlight. In early America, some of the most influential figures made a deliberate choice not to be known. They did not give speeches. They did not sign bold declarations. They did not attach their names to movements or demand recognition for their work. They worked quietly. This was not humility for its own sake. It was strategy. Colonial society had taught a harsh lesson. Visibility attracts pressure. Fame attracts scrutiny. And scrutiny, under imperial rule, could lead to ruin. Those who had watched authority closely understood something essential. Public recognition was not always a reward. Often, it was a risk. To be known was to be watched. To be watched was to be vulnerable. So many chose another path. They influenced conversations instead of leading crowds. They shaped decisions in private rooms rather than public halls. Their names circulated quietly among trusted circles, not printed widely for all to see. This preference for anonymity grew from experience. Men had seen how outspoken leaders became tar. gets. They saw businesses destroyed, reputations smeared, families pressured. Public figures were easier to isolate, easier to intimidate, easier to punish. Quiet influence, however, was harder to trace. If no single person appeared responsible, responsibility dissolved into the group. If ideas seemed to emerge organically, authority struggled to respond. Power that could not be located could not be easily removed. This is why influence in early America often moved sideways, not upward. Ideas spread through conversation, through correspondence, through subtle encouragement. A suggestion here, a connection there. A meeting arranged quietly. Those who understood this dynamic avoided the appearance of leadership. They did not stand at the front. They stood just behind, listening, advising, guiding. Their reward was effectiveness, not applause. This approach also protected ideas themselves. Public figures are forced to simplify, to speak loudly, to repeat slogans. Quiet figures can afford complexity. They can allow ideas to evolve slowly, to be refined through discussion rather than rushed into public debate. In this way, anonymity preserved nuance. The early American environment favored this kind of power. The colonies were interconnected but not centralized. News traveled unevenly. Authority was fragmented. This allowed influence to move through informal channels. People trusted those they knew personally more than those they saw publicly. Reputation mattered more than title. Character mattered more than charisma. Quiet figures thrived in this environment. They became the ones others consulted before acting, the ones whose opinions carried weight even when not stated openly, the ones who shaped direction without issuing commands. This was power without ownership, power without claim, and it was deeply intentional, because those who feared tyranny feared becoming tyrants themselves. They understood that seeking recognition could distort judgment, that fame changes behavior, that applause can tempt leaders to act for image rather than principle. So they stepped back. And in stepping back, they gained something more durable than fame, trust. As revolutionary pressure increased, the value of unseen influence became even clearer. Public figures came and went. Some were celebrated, some were arrested, some were discredited. The spotlight was unstable, but behind these shifting faces, the same quiet figures remained. They were not immune to danger, but they were less exposed. They continued to connect people, to coordinate ideas, to ensure continuity when public leadership faltered. This continuity mattered. Movements fail when they depend too heavily on a few visible individuals. When those individuals are removed, momentum collapses. Early Americans understood this risk instinctively, so they distributed influence. No single voice dominated. No single name defined the cause. No single figure became indispensable. This decent realization protected the movement from collapse. Quiet power also allowed flexibility. Those who avoided public credit could change direction without embarrassment. They could adjust strategies without appearing inconsistent. They could compromise privately while maintaining unity publicly. This adaptability was crucial. Revolution was not a straight path. It required negotiation, patience, and restraint. Loud leaders often became trapped by their own words. Quiet influencers remained free to think. They could listen longer, observe more carefully, act when timing was right. Their influence was subtle, but steady. This approach also shaped the culture of the new nation. After independence, the suspicion of fame did not disappear. Americans continued to value modesty and leadership, at least in principle. They respected those who served and then stepped aside, those who guided without dominating. Public credit was still viewed with caution. Ceremony existed, but it was restrained. Titles were limited, power was divided, authority was checked. These systems reflected the mindset of people who had learned to fear concentrated visibility. Even institutions carried this lesson. Power was intentionally fragmented. Responsibilities were shared, decision-making slowed by procedure. These were not inefficiencies, they were safeguards. They ensured that no one person could easily claim total credit or total control. The preference for quiet influence also explains why contributions remain unnamed. History often records moments, not processes. Speeches, not conversations. Battles, not preparation. But behind every recorded event lies a web of unseen guidance. Those guides rarely left signatures, and many preferred it that way. They believed that true success did not require recognition, that ideas mattered more than authorship, that outcomes mattered more than memory. In choosing anonymity, they protected not only themselves, but the future. Because power that seeks credit eventually seeks preservation, and preservation can become control. The quiet figures of early America understood this danger, so they let others speak, let others be remembered, let others carry the weight of public life. They remained in the background, calm, patient, and steady, and when their work was done, they faded completely. No monuments, no titles, no applause, just influence, woven so deeply into events that it became indistinguishable from history itself. That is the nature of power without public credit. It leaves no echo, but it changes everything. When America won its independence, secrecy did not disappear. It simply changed its purpose. The fear that once drove men underground during colonial rule did not vanish with victory. Instead, it transformed into something quieter and more refined, a habit passed from one generation to the next. The new nation was free, but it was not naive. Those who helped build it understood how fragile power could. LDB. They had seen how quickly authority could grow arrogant, how easily ideals could be lost once institutions became comfortable, so secrecy endured, not as resistance but as continuity. As the United States stabilized, influence shifted from taverns and private homes to something more permanent: universities. American universities became the training grounds for leadership. They were places where future judges, bankers, diplomats, and politicians learned not only knowledge, but behavior. And within these universities, a familiar instinct reappeared: private circles, selective membership, quiet loyalty. Elite groups formed not because freedom was threatened, but because identity needed protection. Young men arriving at these institutions often came from powerful families or aspired to join them. They were preparing for public roles, but learning early that public life required private discipline. Secrecy offered structure. It separated insiders from outsiders. It reinforced trust. It created bonds that outlasted graduation. This was not accidental. European traditions of brotherhood, ritual, and discretion found a natural home in academic environments. Universities already valued ceremony, hierarchy, and tradition. Secret societies simply intensified these qualities. One of the most well-known examples to emerge from this environment was Skull and Bones. Founded in the 19th century at Yale University, Skull and Bones did not present itself as revolutionary. It did not oppose the government. It did not advocate rebellion. Instead, it focused on something subtler, forming elite identity. Membership was limited, selection was quiet. Initiation was ritualized. Privacy was absolute. These elements were not designed to frighten, but to bind. The rituals created shared experience. The secrecy created loyalty. The exclusivity created commitment. Members were taught early that influence did not require visibility, that decisions were often shaped long before they appeared in public, that relationships mattered more than announcements. This philosophy mirrored older traditions, but adapted them for a new era. America no longer needed secret resistance. It needed discreet coordination. Universities provided the perfect setting. Young men could be observed over years. Character could be assessed quietly. Trust could be tested gradually. By the time someone entered public life, networks already existed. These networks did not dictate outcomes, but they shaped opportunities. Who was trusted? Who was recommended? Who was supported quietly when challenges arose? This was influence without command, and it felt familiar because it echoed the same instincts that had shaped early America: suspicion of loud authority, preference for private counsel, belief in restraint over display. Secrecy was no longer about survival. It was about stability. As America entered the modern era, a paradox emerged. The nation celebrated equality, but leadership remained selective. This contradiction made elite secrecy both controversial and enduring. On the surface, democratic ideals promised openness. But beneath the surface, institutions still relied on trust, reputation, and long-term relationships. These could not be created overnight. Elite groups filled that gap. They offered continuity in a rapidly changing world. They preserved norms of behavior among those expected to wield influence. They acted as informal filters, quietly shaping who entered positions of responsibility. Secrecy was essential to this function. If membership lists were public, pressure would follow. If rituals were exposed, meaning would fade. Privacy preserved seriousness. Rituals slowed participants down. They reminded members that privilege carried responsibility, that belonging was not automatic, that loyalty mattered. These groups did not operate through orders. They operated through expectation. Members internalized values rather than obeying commands. They learned discretion, learned patience, learned how to navigate power without appearing to dominate it. This education was subtle but effective. Critics often imagine these societies as controllers of destiny. In reality, their influence was more psychological than mechanical. They did not decide elections. They did not write laws directly. They did not rule from shadows. Instead, they shaped how people thought about leadership. They encouraged calm over emotion, connection over confrontation, long-term thinking over short-term gain. This mindset spread quietly. Graduates entered government, finance, media, and diplomacy. They carried with them habits learned in private spaces, habits of discretion, loyalty, and consultation. Not all used these habits well. Not all influence was benevolent, but the structure endured because it matched America's deeper instincts. A nation born from fear of visible power remained cautious of it, even when powerful itself. Elite secrecy continued because it felt safer than spectacle. It reduced unpredictability. It softened transitions. It created informal accountability where formal systems could not reach. Even today, echoes remain. Private networks still matter. Quiet recommendations still open doors. Trust still travels faster than credentials. The names of societies may fade or change. Their rituals may evolve. But the impulse behind them persists. Because societies, like individuals, remember what once protected them. America remembered secrecy, not as rebellion, not as control, but as a way to handle power carefully. Skull and Bones and similar groups were not anomalies. They were adaptations, modern expressions of an old belief that influence works best when it does not announce itself, that leadership is safest when it is trained quietly, and that some of the most enduring forces in history are shaped not in public squares, but in private rooms, behind closed doors, among people who understand the value of silence. When people do not have answers, they create explanations. This is not a flaw. It is a survival instinct. From the earliest days of human history, uncertainty has made the mind restless. Silence feels unfinished. Gaps in knowledge feel uncomfortable. And when information is hidden, whether intentionally or naturally, the imagination steps in to complete the picture. This is where myth is born. In early America, secrecy was common, practical, and often boring in its reality. But to outsiders, it appeared mysterious. And mystery, once observed from a distance, begins to grow. When people see closed doors, they assume something dramatic must be happening behind them. When they hear whispers, they imagine commands. When they notice symbols, they assume codes. The truth is usually quieter. Secrecy does not automatically mean control. More often it means privacy, caution, or habit. But the human mind prefers clarity, and when clarity is unavailable, it replaces it with narrative. This is why secret societies, private meetings, and closed networks have always attracted stories larger than life. The less people know, the more powerful they imagine the unknown to be. Silence invites projection. This was true in colonial America, and it remains true today. Groups that met privately often did so for mundane reasons: safety, trust, efficiency, or tradition. But because their actions were not visible, observers filled the silence with speculation. Over time, repetiti, on hardened speculation into belief. A story told once is curiosity. A story told many times becomes assumption. An assumption repeated becomes myth. This process does not require deception. It requires only distance. The further people are from the truth, the more dramatic the imagined version becomes. Consider how secrecy functions psychologically. When information is restricted, the mind assumes it must be valuable. When access is limited, the content feels powerful, even if it is ordinary. Scarcity increases perceived importance. This is why private rituals feel mysterious. why coded language feels dangerous, why symbols feel prophetic. In reality, many of these elements exist to slow people down, not control them. Rituals create focus. Symbols teach ideas without argument. Silence prevents miscommunication. But to those outside the circle, they appear intentional, strategic, and commanding. The myth begins there. Even groups like the Freemasons, which left extensive written records explaining their philosophy, became the center of exaggerated stories, not because of what they did, but because of what people assumed they must be doing. The quieter the group, the louder the legend. This is not because truth is hidden, but because human imagination does not tolerate empty space. It fills it, and once filled it resists correction. Myths endure because they are emotionally satisfying. They offer clear villains, clear masterminds, clear explanations for complex events. Reality, by contrast, is often slow, fragmented, and unsatisfying. History is rarely controlled by a single group or plan. It is shaped by coincidence, disagreement, compromise, error, and adaptation. But this version of history feels unstable. It does not comfort the mind. Conspiracy theories offer something comforting: order. They suggest someone is in charge, that outcomes are intentional, that chaos is an illusion. This belief can feel safer than accepting uncertainty. But it misunderstands how power actually works. Real power is messy. It involves conflicting interests, incomplete information, human weakness, and constant negotiation. Even elite groups rarely agree internally. Even influential networks struggle to coordinate consistently. Secrecy does not eliminate chaos. It often exists because chaos already exists. Most private groups form not to dominate events, but to cope with them. They create small zones of trust in unstable environments. They allow discussion without exposure. They preserve continuity when institutions are fragile. None of this requires grand plans, yet from the outside the absence of transparency looks intentional, and so the myth grows. Another reason myths persist is that truth does not announce itself. The real reasons people choose privacy, fear, habit, tradition, caution, are not dramatic. They do not make exciting stories. They do not feel cinematic. So they are ignored. Instead, louder explanations replace them. Over time, and historians must work against accumulated legend. They sift records, letters, and context, only to find that many mysteries dissolve into practicality. A closed meeting becomes a scheduling convenience. A symbol becomes an inherited design. A ritual becomes a teaching method. The truth is not hidden, it is just quieter than the myth. This does not mean secrecy is meaningless. It does shape culture. It does influence behavior. But influence is not the same as control. And understanding that difference is essential. Because when myth replaces reality, fear replaces curiosity. People stop asking why and start assuming who. They stop examining systems and start blaming shadows. Early Americans understood this danger. That is why many secretive groups avoided publicity even after independence. Not because they had something to hide, but because they knew how quickly misunderstanding spreads. They understood that once people believe in hidden masters, trust collapses. Ironically, secrecy intended to protect ideas can later distort them. This is the final lesson. Secrecy creates legends not because it is powerful, but because the human mind demands meaning, and when meaning is not clearly offered, imagination steps in. The truth is often simpler. People meet privately because they are human. They trust small groups more than crowds. They prefer quiet to noise when thinking deeply. They protect what matters to them. No master plan, no invisible hand, just cautious play navigating uncertain times. And perhaps that truth, calm, ordinary, and human, is less frightening than myth, but it is also more honest. Not all influence leaves fingerprints. Some influence settles quietly into systems, shaping them so gradually that later generations mistake the result for something natural, inevitable, even obvious. This is how many private groups shaped American institutions. They did not write laws openly. They did not announce control. They did not claim authority. Instead, they shaped how people thought about structure itself. In the years following independence, the greatest fear was not foreign invasion. It was internal failure. The new nation worried less about enemies and more about instability, about power concentrating too quickly, about ambition overtaking restraint, about chaos replacing order. Those who had lived through colonial rule understood this danger deeply. They had seen what unchecked authority could do. They had also seen what disorder could destroy. So the institutions they helped imagine were designed cautiously. Government was built to move slowly. Decisions required discussion. Authority was divided. Responsibility was shared. No single office could act alone for long. This was not accidental. It reflected habits developed in private circles, habits of consultation, patience, and collective judgment. People who were used to working quietly, without spotlight, naturally preferred systems that did not reward impulsive visibility. Indirect influence works this way. It does not impose outcomes, it shapes preferences. When people who value restraint design institutions, those institutions inherit restraint. Law followed the same pattern. Early legal systems emphasized precedent, procedure, and interpretation, rather than raw force. Laws were written to be debated, challenged, and refined. Process mattered as much as result. This reflected a deep mistrust of absolute certainty. Private groups accustomed to internal discussion understood that truth emerges slowly. That disagreement is not weakness. That stability requires mechanisms for correction. So law became something living, not fixed, not final. Finance, too, absorbed this mindset. Early financial systems were cautious by design. Trust mattered more than speed. Reputation mattered more than scale. Credit depended on relationships, not just numbers. This approach mirrored private networks where trust was earned gradually and broken easily. Money, like influence, was treated as something dangerous if concentrated too quickly. Slow growth was seen as safer than explosive expansion. Education absorbed these habits as well. Institutions of learning emphasized discipline, repetition, and character formation. Knowledge was not rushed. Advancement was measured. Progress required demonstration of reliability, not just talent. This reflected a belief that intelligence without restraint was risky. Private groups that valued discretion believed education should shape behavior as much as thought. That learning was not just about information, but about judgment. None of this required secret control. It required only that people carry their habits with them into public life. And habits, once embedded in institutions, persist long after their origins are forgotten. Once institutions are built, they begin to teach. They teach citizens what is normal, what is acceptable, what is expected. And this is where indirect influence becomes powerful. People entering government learned quickly that patience mattered, that compromise was necessary, that authority required restraint. These lessons were not taught explicitly, they were enforced by structure. Education taught similar lessons. Students learned to wait their turn, to follow process, to respect hierarchy while questioning ideas. These values mirrored the private cultures that helped shape early systems. Finance reinforced caution. Risk was permitted, but controlled. Trust was central. Reputation carried long memory. Failure had consequences that extended beyond the individual. These patterns did not emerge from theory alone. They emerged from people who believed that systems should protect against human weakness, including their own. This is a crucial point. Indirect influence is often misunderstood as manipulation. In reality, it is often self-limitation. Those who feared power most were the ones designing safeguards against it. They built systems that slowed action, that divided responsibility, that required consensus. These systems frustrated efficiency, but preserved stability. Over time, the origins of these choices faded. Later generations inherited the structures without remembering the fears that shaped them. Procedures became tradition. Tradition became expectation. The influence remained, but the influencers disappeared. This disappearance fuels misunderstanding. When people see complex systems without visible authors, they assume hidden controllers. But more often, what they are seeing is institutional memory. Habits frozen into structure. No one needs to control it anymore. The system does the work. That is the quiet success of indirect influence. It does not dominate events. It shapes boundaries. It does not command people. It channels behavior. And because it avoids spectacle, it avoids resistance. This influence also explains why change is difficult. Institutions shaped by caution resist speed. Systems designed to prevent abuse resist concentration. Structures built to slow power resist reform. This is not conspiracy. It is legacy. A legacy created by people who had lived under pressure and wanted to ensure that no future generation would face unchecked authority again. They did not trust individuals to remain virtuous forever. So they trusted systems instead, systems that assume human weakness, systems that slow ambition, systems that reward patience. In this way, private habits became public architecture, not through secret commands, but through design. And once design becomes normal, it no longer feels imposed. It simply feels like the way things work. That is the deepest form of influence, invisible, persistent, and quietly shaping every decision long after the voices that inspired it have fallen silent. Secrecy thrives in dim light. It grows where information moves slowly, where authority is distant, and where speaking openly carries risk. For centuries, brotherhoods existed comfortably in that dimness. They did not dominate it. They adapted to it. But the world changed. Slowly at first, then all at once. As democracy expanded, power began to move closer to the people. Representation widened. Public debate became normalized. Criticism of authority, once dangerous, became expected. This shift did not destroy secret brotherhoods overnight, but it changed the environment they depended on. When people gained the right to speak openly, secrecy lost its necessity. Early democratic systems encouraged visibility. Laws were debated publicly, leaders were questioned. Institutions became accountable, at least in theory, to citizens rather than distant rulers. This transparency altered behavior. Ideas that once required private protection could now survive daylight. Political disagreement became less dangerous. Philosophical debate moved from private rooms to newspapers, pamphlets, and public forums. The whisper was no longer the safest voice. The printed word accelerated this change. As literacy spread and printing became cheaper, information escaped the control of small circles. Knowledge that once moved carefully through trusted networks now traveled freely across regions. Speed replaced patience. What took years to spread quietly could now be shared in days or hours. This created a new problem for secret brotherhoods. They could no longer control interpretation. Symbols lost clarity when exposed to mass audiences. Rituals lost depth when observed rather than experienced. Secrecy itself began to look suspicious rather than protective. The meaning inverted. What was once seen as caution began to look like concealment. What was once privacy began to look like exclusion. Public trust shifted. People no longer assumed silence meant responsibility. They began to expect explanation. Accountability became louder, and brotherhoods, designed for quiet influence, struggled to adapt. Media amplified this pressure. Newspapers, and later radio and television, thrived on exposure. They rewarded revelation. Mystery became entertainment. Private traditions were dissected publicly, often without context. This exposure did not always reveal wrongdoing, but it changed perception. When rituals are removed from their emotional setting, they appear strange. When silence is separated from purpose, it looks evasive. Brotherhoods found themselves misunderstood, not because they had changed, but because the audience had. As a result, many quietly dissolved. Not in crisis, not in scandal, but through irrelevance. They no longer served a function the wider culture needed. Secrecy without necessity became burden. And so, slowly, the age of brotherhoods faded, yet secrecy did not disappear entirely, because even in transparent societies, not everything benefits from exposure. Some brotherhoods adapted rather than vanished. They reduced their reach, softened their rituals, shifted their purpose. Instead of influencing institutions, they focused on individuals. Mentorship replaced coordination. Tradition replaced strategy. Reflection replaced action. In modern times, secrecy survives where speed overwhelms thought. The world is loud now. Opinions are immediate. Reactions are public. Identity is constantly displayed. In such an environment, privacy becomes rare and therefore valuable. Some people seek small, trusted spaces not to control outcomes, but to escape noise. These modern brotherhoods exist quietly, not because they fear punishment, but because they value focus. They offer continuity in a culture that constantly resets. They slow people down. They are no longer engines of influence. They are sanctuaries. Democracy made secrecy unnecessary for survival, but it did not eliminate the human desire for belonging, ritual, and trust. Media made privacy difficult, but it did not remove the need for reflection away from performance. So secrecy changed shape. It became smaller, less ambitious, less powerful, and perhaps healthier. The great era of hidden coordination ended because it was no longer required. Systems became stronger, institutions more stable, ideas more protected by law than by silence. Brotherhoods that once guarded ideas released them into public life. Those that remain now guard something else entirely: attention. They protect time from distraction, conversation from spectacle, meaning from immediacy. This is their final evolution, not as shadows behind power, but as quiet rooms beside it. And in this way, the story comes full circle. Secrecy began as protection. It became influence, then legacy, then memory. Now it survives only where noise overwhelms thought. The brotherhoods faded not because they failed, but because they succeeded. They helped create a world where secrecy was no longer required to imagine freedom. And that may be their greatest, quietest achievement. History often remembers the loud moments, but it is shaped by the quiet ones. And as you rest now, remember that some of the most powerful forces do not disappear. They simply become unnecessary.